Hey everyone, tonight we're drifting back to one of the strangest, quietest chapters in human history. A time when the world fell apart, but somehow, life still went on. So, get comfortable. Maybe dim the lights. Maybe let your tea cool just a little. Because tonight we're not talking about kings or queens, or great battles. We're talking about the babies born in the middle of the apocalypse, the children of the Black Death. It sounds almost poetic, doesn't it? But of course it wasn't. It was, as usual, a disaster with extra steps. The Black Death swept through Europe from around 1347 to 1351, although, really, swept makes it sound a bit too graceful. It was more like Europe accidentally spilled a pot of boiling plague and spent 4 years trying to mop it up with a dead rat. By the time the waves calmed, something like half of Europe's population had died. In some regions, it was closer to 70%. Entire villages vanished. Not in some poetic sense, but literally gone. No one left to bury anyone. Just roofs collapsing into themselves. And yet, people kept having children. Because even when the world ends, apparently, humans have a schedule to keep. Imagine being born in 1348. Your first lullaby is the sound of church bells tolling for the dead. Your first smell is smoke from the fires meant to purify the air. Because people thought the plague floated in miasmas, invisible clouds of bad smell. And your first toy, if you were lucky, was probably a stick, because everything else had been burned. The mothers who gave birth during the plague were, in a sense, survivors already. Pregnancy was risky in the best of times. In plague years, it was heroic. Midwives still traveled house to house, carrying their tools wrapped in cloth, whispering prayers as they worked. They knew the risk. Touching a sick woman breathing her air, it could all end within days, but people still tried. Because that's what humans do. They try, often against their own best interests. The children born in those years were sometimes called plague babies. It wasn't a term of endearment. In some places, people believed these infants were marked, touched by death itself. They might be immune, or they might be cursed. No one could really decide. There are medieval chronicles that mention unholy births, where babies were said to have strange features, pale eyes, mottled skin, unusual cries. But really, those were just the results of malnutrition, infection, or stress. It's hard to glow with health when your entire village is composting. Still, some people thought these children were different, and in a way they were. Those who survived infancy grew up in a world with far fewer people, fewer workers, fewer lords, fewer priests, and that meant surprisingly more opportunity. Imagine being a peasant child in 1355. The old hierarchies had thinned out like fog. Fields lay empty. Houses stood vacant. If you could walk, you could work. If you could work, you could earn. And for perhaps the first time in European history, the poor realized that their labor was worth something. The generation born during or right after the plague became, quietly, one of the most economically powerful groups of the Middle Ages. They didn't start out rich, of course. Most of them started out with nothing, except an unusually high inheritance-to-relative ratio. You see, when half of your cousins are dead, you inherit faster. Land, tools, a goat, all came your way sooner than expected. By the 1360s and 1370s, this new generation began reshaping Europe's economy from the ground up. Wages rose, the feudal system started to wobble. Some historians even call this the birth of the working class, a strange gift left behind by a terrible disease. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. The early years were grim. If you were born during the plague, your odds of survival weren't great. Mothers often died in childbirth, sometimes midwives too. And infant mortality, already sky-high, soared. Some parents refused to nurse their children, afraid that physical closeness would spread the plague. Wet nurses became scarce. And even the church began to worry about baptisms, since priests were dying so quickly that water itself seemed suspicious. Yet somehow, through all this, the cycle continued. We have a few first-hand glimpses of these plague-born children, scattered in medieval records. There's a parish note from Siena in 1350 describing a boy born of a mother dead with plague. Apparently the midwife cut him out after the mother passed. He lived for a few hours. It's morbid, yes, but also strangely tender, that they even tried. In another record from England, A baby girl was baptized with vinegar instead of water because the priest thought it would kill the corruption. It didn't. She died within a week. So you can see, medicine was still very much in its vibes and vinegar stage. Let's drift for a moment to how people thought about these plague children, because medieval minds had a special talent for superstition. Some claimed that these babies were immune, blessed by God, or simply forged stronger by surviving such a cursed world. There were even rumors that they couldn't catch the plague later in life. Of course, this wasn't true, but it comforted people. And comfort in 1350 was rare enough to be worth believing. As they grew, these children found themselves in an oddly empty world. Imagine playing in streets that once held hundreds, but now echoed with your own footsteps. Imagine being told stories of how it used to be, how full, how loud, how alive everything was, and realizing you might never know that kind of noise. Historians sometimes call this the loneliest generation, because so many families were gone, and in their place, only ghosts and memories remained. Education changed too. There weren't enough teachers, so the few surviving schools often combined classes, tiny, half-filled rooms where the children of merchants, peasants, and sometimes even nobles sat together. It was awkward, but it worked, and it quietly began to erode centuries of class division. By the time these plague-born kids reached adulthood, Europe was full of people who'd grown up believing, correctly, that nothing was truly permanent. Not kings, not priests, not the rich. And that mindset would eventually lead to revolts, reformations, and the slow crumbling of feudalism itself, all because a few babies were stubborn enough to survive. Now, it's tempting to romanticize this generation, to imagine them as brave survivors, rebuilding a broken world. And in some ways they were, but many of them were also traumatized. There was no word for trauma back then, of course, but they lived with the shadows of loss. Parents gone, siblings gone, friends gone. Even years later, when the plague ended, the memory of those empty streets never quite left. You can see it in their art, the skeleton dances, the skull-filled paintings, the fascination with death that dominated the late Middle Ages. They called it the danse macabre, and though it looks grim to us, for them it was strangely comforting. Because if death was dancing, at least it was still keeping them company. Among nobles, the experience was a little different, but no less strange. Royal families were terrified of contagion, so they fled to country estates and castles far from the cities. Queen Philippa of Hainault, wife of England's Edward III, reportedly isolated her entire household. Servants were disinfected with vinegar, and no one from London was allowed near. Still, nobles weren't immune. Edward's daughter Joan died of the plague at just 15, on her way to Spain to marry the prince there. The match had been arranged years earlier, as all royal marriages were. The ships were ready, the dowries exchanged, and then plague boarded the vessel before she did. It was a reminder, to everyone from peasant to prince, that no amount of silk could keep death out. But the surviving royal children, the ones born after or during the plague, grew up with that lesson burned into them. They were cautious, paranoid, often deeply religious. Many believed their birth was proof of divine mercy, that they'd been spared for a reason, which, in practice, usually meant they became extremely superstitious and occasionally unbearable. For instance, Charles VI of France, born in 1368, just after the worst waves, suffered from severe mental illness later in life. He believed he was made of glass. He refused to let people touch him for fear of shattering. Modern historians suspect schizophrenia, but his courtiers just called it the madness of the age. And really, that description fits more people than you'd think. Across Europe, this generation lived with a sense that the world could end at any moment, because to them, it already had once. You can see the melancholy in their architecture, too. Churches became more ornate, more fragile-looking, filled with delicate carvings and stained glass that caught the faintest light. It was beauty built by people who understood impermanence. They were trying, in stone and glass, to capture something lasting in a world that clearly wasn't. Meanwhile, medicine stumbled along in the dark. People wanted to understand why their babies were dying, or why some survived when others didn't. So they invented theories, bad air, divine punishment, planetary alignment. A few physicians even suggested the plague had purified the human race, weeding out the weak, which sounds deeply unpleasant and deeply medieval. But ironically, there might have been a sliver of truth. Some genetic studies suggest that descendants of plague survivors carry mutations that make them more resistant to certain immune diseases today. So, in a roundabout way, the babies who lived through the Black Death may have passed on a strange kind of strength, a legacy carved from disaster. It's easy to forget, when we talk about the Middle Ages, that history isn't just kings and wars. It's babies too. Tiny wrinkled survivors born into chaos, swaddled in rags, breathing air thick with fear and incense. And somehow they made it. The next time you see a medieval painting filled with angels and skeletons dancing together, remember, the artist probably grew up among plague children. They were the ones who learned early on that life and death were neighbors, always knocking on each other's doors. Let's drift now quietly into the next part of the story, when those plague-born children grew up, fell in love, and started their own families. Because what happens when a generation raised among ghosts tries to create life again? We'll find out in part 2. Hey everyone, welcome back. Tonight we're drifting into something a little aromatic, because history isn't just dates and kings and plagues. It's also sweat and garlic and whatever happened to be rotting under the nearest bridge. Yes, we're talking about how medieval people really smelled, and perhaps more surprisingly, how much they actually cared about it. So, get cozy, light a candle if you like, maybe something herbal, rosemary, sage, lavender, all very medieval choices. And let's float back to a time when personal hygiene was less about 10-step skincare routines and more about not dying of dysentery. There's a very popular image of the Middle Ages. You know the one. Peasants caked in mud, kings in gold but somehow equally greasy, and everyone bathing once a year, usually by accident. It's a vivid picture, and like most vivid pictures, it's also mostly wrong. People did bathe. Quite a lot, actually, but not quite the way we think. Let's start with the basics. Water in the Middle Ages was complicated. If you were a peasant, you didn't have a bathtub. You had a river. Or, if you were lucky, a wooden tub filled with water fetched from that river. Heating it took time, firewood, and effort, all things peasants rarely had enough of. So they washed the way birds do, a little at a time, mostly what showed. Hands, face, maybe the feet if they were feeling luxurious. This was called ablution, and it was usually done daily. A full-body bath, though? That was an event. For the wealthy, it was another story. Medieval nobles didn't just bathe. They performed it. There are records of lords and ladies soaking in tubs lined with linen, surrounded by flowers, and even scented with oils or herbs. Rose petals, chamomile, thyme, things that smelled nice and allegedly warded off bad spirits. Because of course everything had to ward off bad spirits. Bathing could even be social. You'd invite friends, musicians, maybe even your physician, who'd stand by and declare how wonderfully balanced your humors looked that evening. It was in short an Instagram spa day, only with more fleas. Speaking of fleas, yes, they were everywhere, but it's important to understand why. It wasn't that medieval people didn't care about cleanliness. They did. They just didn't have a germ theory. When you don't know what bacteria are, you focus on what you can sense. Smell. A bad smell meant sickness. So people became obsessed with perfumes, incense, and scented cloths. If you smelled good, you were safe, or at least you were trying your best to smell safer than your neighbors. Cities had public bathhouses too, something many people forget. In fact, in places like Paris, Nuremberg, and London, there were hundreds. They weren't exactly health spas, more like the medieval version of a gym and cafe combined. You could bathe, gossip, get a massage, or, depending on the establishment, hire company for the evening. In fact, the line between bathhouse and brothel was, shall we say, moistly blurred. By the 15th century, moralists were furious about it, so naturally they did what moralists always do, banned fun things in the name of purity, and public bathing slowly faded from fashion. Ironically, just in time for the Renaissance, the period everyone assumes was more civilized. But before we get too smug about it, let's remember, the medieval sense of smell wasn't entirely wrong. They knew foul air carried disease, not because of microbes, but because of miasmas, the invisible clouds of corruption that rose from filth. Their solution? Make everything smell better. Cities burned herbs in the streets, doctors carried pomanders, little metal balls filled with spices, which they'd sniff constantly to ward off bad air. The famous plague doctors with their long beaked masks? Those weren't for intimidation. They were early air fresheners. The beak was stuffed with lavender, mint, or vinegar-soaked cloths. In other words, they were basically walking diffusers. And how about body odor? Well, it's complicated. People certainly smelled more natural, but not necessarily foul by their own standards. They were used to the scent of wool, smoke, tallow, and skin. Soap existed, yes, often made from animal fat and lye, but it was harsh. So most people used alternatives: herbal scrubs, sand, or even bran mixed with water. Clothing absorbed most of the daily grime, which is why they changed their linen shirts and undergarments often. In some households, every few days. The linen acted as a sponge, soaking up sweat and oil. In other words, they didn't clean their bodies as much as they outsourced cleanliness to their shirts. A bit like medieval dry cleaning. And those who could afford perfume, oh, they used it. Medieval perfumery was a serious art. Civet, musk, ambergris, all harvested from animals in ways that were, frankly, unmentionable before bed. But mixed with roses, violets, and herbs, they made scents that lingered on gloves, hair, even beards. Yes, perfumed beards were a thing, because why stop at smelling decent when you can weaponize your chin? Let's drift now to monasteries, the other, often overlooked centers of cleanliness. Monks bathed regularly, though not for luxury. It was about discipline. They washed before prayer, before meals, and before copying manuscripts. One abbot even declared that a dirty monk is no monk at all. Though to be fair, he lived in Italy, where water was easier to come by. In Northern Europe, rules were more flexible. A little frostbite in the holy water never hurt anyone, apparently. So did people care how they smelled? Yes, deeply. They just didn't divide smell into clean or dirty the way we do. To them, scent was moral, even spiritual. The perfume of a saint's relic was said to prove its holiness. The stench of a sinner was proof of corruption. So much so that saints who died often had their bodies described as emitting the odor of sanctity, which, I regret to inform you, was not literal. It was just the medieval version of saying they were a good person. And then came the irony of all ironies. When the Renaissance rolled around, supposedly the dawn of modernity, bathing actually declined. Why? Because doctors decided that water could open the pores, letting disease in. So the new elite started washing less, not more. They bathed rarely, but they changed clothes often, doused themselves in perfume, and prayed for the best. Louis XIV of France famously claimed he only bathed twice in his life, which, given his perfume collection, might actually be true. But then again, this was a man who built Versailles, a palace without enough toilets. So let's just say his olfactory standards were complicated. Meanwhile, the peasants kept bathing quietly in rivers, not because they'd read the latest medical theory, but because it was hot and they worked outside. So, ironically, the poor might have smelled better than their perfumed betters. History, as usual, has a sense of humor. Let's drift briefly through the streets of a medieval city. It's summer, it's crowded, there's no plumbing. Waste runs down open gutters, mixing with rain, animal dung, and occasionally people's hopes. The air smells like bread, smoke, manure, and humanity, layered like a stew. Not pleasant, but not quite unbearable, because this was the smell of life, and when the wind blew the right way, carrying incense from a church or rosemary from a market stall, the city almost smelled alive. Now, to sleep to that thought might sound strange, but there's something oddly human in it, in knowing that across centuries, everyone has cared, in their own way, about how they smell. The medieval world wasn't filthy because people didn't care. It was filthy because life was hard, and resources were few. But amid all that, they still sought beauty, fragrance, and ritual. They washed with rosewater. They hung herbs above their doors. They lit candles that smelled of beeswax and prayer. And that, perhaps, is what makes them feel closest to us. They wanted to feel clean, not just in body, but in soul. So the next time someone tells you medieval people never bathed, you can gently smile and say, well, actually they did, just not the way you'd think. Then maybe light a little rosemary for them. They'd appreciate that. Let's drift now, softly, toward our next late-night question. What did cavemen actually do all day? Because it turns out, between the hunting and the fire-making, they had a surprising amount of free time. We'll explore that in Part 3. Hey everyone. Tonight, we're drifting back to marble halls and candlelit courtyards, to the echoing world of ancient Rome, a place where power was absolute, fashion was fatal, and marriage was a political weapon with better jewelry. We're not talking about emperors tonight, though. We've heard enough about them. The paranoid toga-clad narcissists who mistook divine will for personal convenience. No, tonight we're talking about the women who married them, the forgotten wives, the ones history half-remembered and then quietly misplaced. So, settle in, because Roman matrimony wasn't a love story. It was a negotiation held at knife point, and everyone smiled through it. If you've ever read Roman history, you'll notice the pattern. An emperor rises, he marries someone respectable, then he either kills her, divorces her for political reasons, or pretends she doesn't exist. And that's on a good day. Roman emperors loved being worshipped. They were less enthusiastic about being married. Marriage in Rome wasn't about affection. It was about dynasty. A woman's job was to produce heirs and look divine while doing it. She was the empire's womb, beautifully decorated, but ultimately replaceable. Let's start with Livia Drusilla, wife of Emperor Augustus. You might call her the prototype Roman empress. Elegant, intelligent, and allegedly fatally patient. When Augustus met her, she was already married. Pregnant, in fact. That didn't stop him. He divorced his own wife, she divorced her husband, and they married 3 days after she gave birth to another man's child. Because romance in ancient Rome worked on a very tight schedule. They stayed married for over 50 years, a remarkable record in imperial terms. And yet, Livia spent most of that time walking the fine line between influence and accusation. People whispered she poisoned rivals, manipulated her son into succession, and controlled Augustus with charm and arsenic. Was any of it true? Possibly not. But as we know, in history, a powerful woman only has to be rumored deadly. Evidence is optional. When Augustus died, he was declared a god. Livia was declared his priestess, which sounds like a promotion until you realize it meant she could never remarry. She lived out her final years as the divine widow, worshipping her late husband like an unpaid intern at his eternal fan club. And when she died, her son Tiberius refused to attend her funeral. Because of course he did. Roman family values were nothing if not consistent. Next, let's drift to Messalina, wife of Emperor Claudius. Now, Claudius was not the empire's brightest marble bust. He stuttered, limped, and had the social presence of wet bread. So naturally, his much younger wife found alternative hobbies. Messalina has gone down in history as the wicked empress, accused of everything from serial adultery to running a brothel in the palace. Ancient sources claim she once competed in a contest with Rome's most famous courtesan to see who could sleep with more men in a single night. The number was 25. Apparently Messalina won. Is that true? Almost certainly not. But Romans adored gossip, especially about powerful women, and Messalina, young and ambitious, was an easy target. What is true is that she conspired politically, made enemies, and eventually paid for it. One day, while her husband was away, she tried to marry her lover in a mock ceremony. The Senate panicked, assumed it was a coup, and ordered her death. Claudius, ever decisive, hesitated. So a soldier handled it. Messalina was executed in her garden, still pleading that she was innocent. Claudius dined that night as usual. He even asked for more wine, because Roman emperors processed grief about as well as they processed democracy. Then there was Agrippina the Younger, Claudius's next wife, and awkwardly his niece. Yes, that Agrippina, mother of Nero, a woman with so much ambition it could have been classified as a natural resource. When she married Claudius, she was praised for her virtue. When she outlived him, she was accused of poisoning him. You'll notice this theme recurring. To her credit, Agrippina made an art form of survival. She maneuvered her teenage son Nero onto the throne and ruled beside him for several years. But as Nero grew older, and somehow less stable than usual, She became inconvenient. He tried to have her drowned. She swam to shore. He sent assassins. She told them, "Strike my womb first, the womb that bore Nero," which is both chilling and extremely on brand for Roman motherhood. And yes, they struck, because love, in the imperial household, always came with a dagger. It's easy to see why these women were forgotten. Their stories were told by men who found them threatening, fascinating, or both. They were recorded as villains because there wasn't a category yet for politically competent. A good Roman wife was supposed to be silent and pious. A bad one was ambitious, outspoken, and impossible to control. Which means, statistically, most of the interesting ones were bad. Take Poppaea Sabina, Nero's later wife. She's remembered mostly for her beauty, which was said to be legendary. But even beauty was dangerous in that palace. Poppaea allegedly persuaded Nero to kill his mother, Agrippina. Then she bore him a child, who died soon after birth. Later, while pregnant again, she reportedly insulted him. Nero kicked her in a rage, killing her and the baby. That's the official version anyway. Roman historians had a habit of blaming women for being victims, and Nero, conveniently, wasn't available for comment, being dead and all. Afterward, he had Poppaea embalmed and displayed in ivory and gold. A loving gesture, if you ignore everything that came before it. The forgotten wives weren't just victims of violence. They were also victims of erasure. When an emperor died, his successor often destroyed statues, inscriptions, and portraits of his wife, especially if she'd been unpopular. The Romans even had a phrase for it: damnatio memoriae, the condemnation of memory. Imagine being deleted from history by imperial decree. Your name scraped off marble, your face hammered from coins. And then, centuries later, a historian opens a scroll and calls you noteworthy mainly for her scandalous behavior. That's what happened to women like Domitia Longina, wife of Domitian. She was banished for alleged infidelity, recalled later, and then erased after his death. The empire turned her life into a rumor. And yet, despite everything, these women mattered. They hosted foreign ambassadors. They mediated disputes. They arranged marriages and managed estates that rivaled small kingdoms. Some even funded public works, temples, baths, libraries. Livia's villa alone contained gardens that would make Versailles look like a window box. But those details rarely made it into history books, because men writing about politics didn't consider horticulture an achievement. Even when they behaved properly, they couldn't win. Take Octavia, first wife of Nero and sister of Emperor Britannicus. She was gentle, quiet, and loyal, exactly what Rome claimed to admire. Nero divorced her anyway, accusing her of infertility and adultery. Then he had her exiled and executed. The people of Rome were so outraged they protested in the streets, which in Rome was basically career suicide. Nero sent troops to quiet them. Octavia's head was sent to his mistress as a gift, and that was that. So yes, Roman marriage counseling was a bit more decisive. Not every empress met a grim end. Some managed to die peacefully, which was almost an accomplishment. But even then, their reputations often didn't survive. If a woman was powerful and successful, she was labeled manipulative. If she was obedient and harmless, she was forgotten entirely. History, for centuries, preferred its women one-dimensional, and the Roman Empire, with its marble statues and moral double standards, set the tone. So what did these forgotten wives smell like, sound like, dream about? We can only guess, but traces of them remain, in letters, coins, mosaics. Their jewelry still turns up in the ruins of villas. Their portraits, half erased, still watch from museum walls. They outlived gossip, if not memory. If you walk through the ruins of the Palatine Hill in Rome, you can still feel them there. The wind moving through empty courtyards where once they stood, dressed in silk, smiling at senators, pretending they had a choice. You can almost hear the quiet footsteps of women who learned to survive in a world that worshipped men and feared mothers. Their stories remind us that empire is rarely built by those whose names survive it. It's built by those whose names were carefully forgotten. So, the next time you read about some emperor's glorious reign, remember, behind every divine Augustus or great Nero stood a woman who probably rolled her eyes, quietly, and at great personal risk. Let's drift, then, to the next forgotten corner of history, to a world before marble and empire, where survival didn't come from power, but from patience. Next time, we'll wander back to the simplest question of all. What did cavemen actually do all day? Because once upon a time, before baths, before crowns, before gossip, people still woke up, stretched, and tried to get through another day. And somehow, they did.